Hello there, Evie here, and welcome to the Lian Lancool II Mesh. Now this is a complicated case, so we'd better get started. Timestamps in the video description with chapters in the timeline and Amazon associate links if you fancy picking this one up. Starting with the unboxing, normally quite boring, but this one's slightly different. The Lancool II Mesh is contained within a massive lower expanded polystyrene mold, which is something I've never seen this large on a case before. So that's an excellent start. What about the case itself? There's a lot to cover, which amongst other things is why this video has taken such a long time to produce. We'll get started with the exterior at the front. As the name suggests, it's a full mesh front panel, which also handles the filtering of the intake air. Just below the shiny Lian logo is a handle-shaped gap, which allows you to rip the front panel from the case in a rather abrupt manner. This of course exposes the fans inside, but also exposes the high build quality of the panel itself. Stiff as a wedding. How about the sides? This is where the complications start. Each side has a similar layout with a lower bottom hinged panel that exposes the basement section. On the main compartment side, this lower panel is perforated for increased ventilation, a step further than most mesh cases around. And to the rear compartment side, it's a solid panel which should help with reducing visibility of all the cables coming out of the power supply unit. It's not all roses and sunshine, however. The magnets that hold these panels can create quite a loud clash as the panel is closed, unless you're very careful. There are foam pads over the magnets, but it's not enough to prevent metal on metal contact. The second those magnets start to engage on the way up, they start accelerating the panel towards the chassis, and yeah, unless you are careful with your fingers and your hands trying to replace them back, it's going to be a clatter. And this will eat away at the paint job over time. I've got a couple of images I'll show you now from the end of the review. Onto the upper glass panels. These are side hinged and swing open past 180 degrees, but require the lower panel to be opened before they can be opened, unless you get crafty and probably put your fingernails in places they shouldn't be. They can also be completely removed from the hinges, but in the interest of full disclosure, I didn't figure this out until way later into my review, since the main compartment side window took so much effort to remove that I thought it was fixed. Enough about the side panels though. To the rear, it's your typical ATX case layout with a lower power supply unit section, central PCI Express slot section, and a top fan and rear I/O section. The base has a little more going on. To the front, it has that handle cutout for the front panel, a hint at a load of positions for the internal drive cage, and holding up the rear is the power supply unit filter, which is massive. It's also louvered, which could be for noise suppression or airflow guidance, but it's not without its own issue, that being the excess filter sheet that gets caught on the chassis when being removed. Your mileage may vary with that one. It's actually turned out to be not that big of an issue, so there we go. And last but not least for the exterior, it's the top of the case. To the front is the front I/O, which from left to right consists of the ARGB color and mode buttons, a reset switch, power button, combined mic and headphone jack, two USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports, and a cover for an additional USB Type-C add-on which can be bought as an extra, a theme that extends much further. Just behind said front I/O is the magnetically applied top filter, which not only covers all of the slots for the various fan and radiator mounts, but the manual and lovely thank you card asking you to advertise their stuff. I'm cynical by nature, what can I say? But you could win something by doing so, which is completely up to you. Back to the manual for a second, it's actually really good. Believe it or not, it actually uses photographs of the actual product to show you how it all works. That's as innovative as I've seen in half the cases I've reviewed. Good job, Lian. In terms of its content, nearly all variations have part position and component clearance accounted for, and there's a section for the optional extras if you really want to deck this thing out, but it will cost you. There are also details pertaining to the performance and RGB versions. Keep those in mind if you're strongly considering this case. So that's just a fraction of the more complex than your typical case features in the Lancool II II Mesh, and we haven't even started on the inside. So let's get started with the drive options, which is a very strong point for this case. Starting with the drive cage, it's accessible through the mesh basement cover on the main compartment side and houses what are very similar to workstation style sleds. They can take 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch drives, and the cage itself has some neat cutouts to the rear panel to access the power and data connectors of the drives. This panel can also be replaced with a optional hot swap back plate. The cage sits on top of a panel that allows it to slide forwards and backwards in 9 incremental notches. This allows more or less space to be given to the power supply units and radiator zones to the back and front. However, I didn't find a way to remove the drive cage entirely. I'm sure there is some kind of way of doing it, but it wasn't obvious and it was a bit fiddly to try and figure out. And if not possible, I don't see any major issues with retaining it in place anyway. 2.5-inch drives next. There are a couple of slots to the inside of the rear basement cover panel. These can be utilized with the grommets and screws from the parts box, which I didn't get a shot of, but the manual has me covered there. Back to the side panel drive mounting. You can rearrange the positions of these two panels in the 3 positions available, one to the front which is blank. Behind the motherboard tray there are another couple of positions that require a couple of sets of drive screws to mount the drives onto the sleds, and in the main compartment there are another couple of 2.5-inch drive positions in the form of the removable basement cover panels. This takes the total up to 3 3.5-inch drives and 6 2.5-inch drives, or if you really wanted 9 2.5-inch drives, which will get you in the ballpark of 18 to 24 terabytes of storage with conventional hard drives, minus anything mounted to the motherboard like an M.2 or something. Back to those basement cover panels for a second. If you really wanted to, you could remove these entirely and go with a couple of 120mm fans to assist the cooling of your graphics card. This could actually work in this case with the lower mesh basement cover panel. To the front there's space for a couple of 140mm fans, or a few 120mm fans. This case comes with 3 120mm ARGB fans up front, and to answer the question that everyone asks, which is, what are the fans in that case? I want to buy additional ones. They're basic, low-cost fans that aren't part of Lian Li's standard range. As with most cases that includes fans of any kind, especially RGB or ARGB fans, unless they specify on their website or marketing material that they're special or ones in their range, they're basically the sort of standard basic fans, no-name things with a logo on the side and spec on the sticker. Not that they're bad fans, it's just that they're not part of their premium ranges, which do look very fancy. The back supports a single 120mm fan, and the top provides mounting options for a couple of 120 or 140mm fans. Emphasis on the word options. There are slots providing the install of the fans and the radiators closer or further away from the motherboard, potentially for better clearance with sizable radiators or better cooling with some fans over the motherboard. Speaking of radiators, what about them? Well, this is where it gets a little more complicated. Simple parts first. The rear can take a 120mm radiator and the top can take a 240mm radiator. And if you got really creative, you could mount a 240mm radiator to the base, but it's not officially supported, and you shouldn't need to if you've got the rest. Now for the more complex part. The front panel can be mounted in, first it has a panel. It can be mounted in 4 different ways. First, you can slide it into the lower or higher slots, which changes how deep it sits within the front chassis. And then you can orient it with the mounting face inwards or outwards, which gives you those 4 options. But then you can remove or retain the forward basement cover panel to give you more or less available depth. So here's how I'm presenting the clearance options you've got, all of which I've measured, so plus or minus 1mm or so, and this is with the drive cage furthest back, which doesn't fully clear the basement cutout with the panel removed. So all internal measurements are basically to the drive cage. You can analyze this yourself, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's say you want to remove the basement cover and position the bracket in the lower slot with the mounting face outwards. This gives you 113mm of internal clearance for fans and radiators and 13mm of external space before getting too close to the closest angled parts of the front panel at the front there. If you were to turn the bracket around so the mounting face is inwards, this would give you 74mm of internal clearance and 52mm of external clearance. The rest you should be able to analyze yourself, but I'll acknowledge the red text before we move on. With the base panel replaced, the bracket in the higher slot, which moves it deeper into the case, and the mounting face facing inwards, the bracket clashes with the base panel, so it's not a viable option. What an ordeal. Well, at least nobody can say this case doesn't provide enough options. So how about the rest of the components then? The power supply unit clearance space is roughly 214mm, and this isn't expanded by the shifting of the drive cage, since the mount for the drive cage itself is the limiting factor. However, moving the drive cage further forward yields larger space to store and terminate cables from the power supply unit. Onto the motherboard clearance, it's up to an ATX board in the standard configuration, but there's another panel next to the motherboard section that can be rotated to increase support up to a 280mm wide eATX board. Maybe to something that might be able to take advantage of all of the drives this thing can take. CPU cooler clearance sits at 176mm, plenty of room to take the biggest coolers on the market. I think I saw 172mm on PC Part Picker was the max that they've got on there, so, you know, plenty. Clearance for the graphics card is sufficient for up to a 377mm long and 179mm wide graphics card, and due to the lack of steel between the slot covers, you can upgrade to a vertical bracket, which should work well with the extra width this case provides. One thing I did want to point out here, though, was the screws. Yes, they're fancy screws, nice and heavy for a nice high quality feel. But it's form over function, since they don't work as well as your bog standard screw for this purpose. Because of the extra weight, they have a far higher chance of falling or slipping off your screwdriver, at best being annoying and at worst damaging the paintwork on impact. Not a big deal by any means, but if I were designing a case, I'd probably drop the fancy screws for ones that just work better. And last but by no means least, we've got to discuss the cable management. This again is a massive strong point for this case. For a start, you don't even need to care about how neat it looks, since most of it that fits behind the motherboard tray gets covered by these two massive panels, leaving just the SSDs on show through the side panel window. An excellent look, if not a kind of inefficient use of materials. Moving on from that, we have this panel, and its only job is to be there to hold things. You can place it in a few different positions, and it's a really nice dedicated touch for my NZXT grid, for example. And lastly, there's the hit and miss panel we saw earlier, in addition to a pile of cable management loops, included Velcro straps and holes for the cables to be routed through. I'd be completely satisfied without the cover panels over this, so it's a first class execution award for cable management. So that's the build complete, now onto the testing and results. But first, let's cover the setups. First up is the stock max setup. Here we take the stock fans and ramp them up to full speed, nice and simple. Next, we replace all of the stock fans with a pile of my test fans. The second setup, the optimal acoustic setup, uses these test fans and has their speed tuned to meet 36.5 dBA. And the third setup spins all the fans up to full speed, which is optimal max test setup. All of these setups cover the performance of the stock setup and the performance of the case itself. So let's start off with the stock max test setup and priority 5 with Furmark. Like when I was reviewing the test results in the other case videos, their respective reviews, it's worth noting all of these cases are designed for strong airflow with full front mesh intakes. The Lancool II Mesh has done reasonably well here, certainly a step ahead of the TD500 Mesh in CPU thermals, and only really beaten by the filterless Aero 1 and the really strong and much cheaper Signum. But this isn't an even playing field kind of test. Some cases have more or less fans that run at different speeds. So moving on to the cooling specs for this test, you can see that the Lancool II Mesh's fans were hitting 1300 RPM, which is exactly where the spec said they should run. That's the average of all the fans, by the way. And this would appear to make the case slightly louder than the TD500 Mesh with 3 slower fans and the Forge 100R with 2 faster fans. No surprises there. It's also worth noting that the Lancool II Mesh is the largest case on this board at just under 55 litres. The stock max testing with Firestrike yielded very similar results, so we'll move on to the optimal acoustic setup. This swaps all the stock fans with a pile of my test fans. For the Lancool II Mesh, we have 3 front intakes, 1 top exhaust and one rear exhaust, and all of these fans are limited to match the 36.5 dBA acoustic target at 40 centimeters from the case. Explained that before, I shouldn't have done it twice. With the playing field acoustically leveled, the Lancool II Mesh is right in front of the pack, well, just behind the test bench, but it's clearly doing very well, and like the rest of the group with the highly ventilated front panels, the Lancool II Mesh had to bring the fan speed just above the stall line of around 30% or 600 RPM. Again, the Firestrike results are very much the same, the Lancool II Mesh being comfortably ahead of the rest. So we'll finish up the I nearly removed the HDMI cable there. So we'll finish up the test results with the optimal max setup, same fans, only at full speed. Here the Lancool II Mesh barely lost to the unfiltered Aero 1 in terms of GPU thermals, but it's within tolerance, so you can call it a straight tie. However, in terms of CPU thermals, it smashes it, matching the unfiltered Aero 1 and the MB311L. Same result with the Firestrike testing, but how about the noise level? Well, it's right on board with the rest of the group, actually a touch quieter than most, which results in this case being an excellent performer all round. But at what cost? You can pick the Lancool II Mesh up for around £100, €110 or $120, which makes this the second most expensive case behind the Core P3 test bench, and a little more expensive than the TD500 Mesh. Combining this with the test results from the acoustically normalized Firestrike test data, and just going on thermal and acoustic performance, it's very close to being equal for the €110, but falls a little short in pounds and dollars. So would I recommend this over the TD500 Mesh? Well, that depends on what you need. If you want a case that's more accessible thanks to the side panel design, more compatibility for radiators, a little more help in the cable management department, and enough drive compatibility to last you significantly long time, longer than say the TD500 Mesh in most cases, at least if you're an average user, or if you just need more drive space in general, then if you can pay an extra £15, €10 or $20, a drop in the bucket considering the cost of a full system, then it's absolutely worth it. There's just so much on offer with this one, it's a bit of a no-brainer. But if you don't need any of that, then is it still worth it? Maybe. If you really want the dual tempered glass side panels and the cleaner front mesh panel, again, not comparing to anything other than the TD500 Mesh here, for the small relative increase in price considering the total system cost, this might still be worth it for a lot of people, but if you're on the edge, perhaps consider waiting for a voucher or a sale to come along if you're just not quite sure. But I've got nothing but glowing praise with a few minor complaints for this one. So there we have it. Am I wrong on this one? Have I fallen into the Lian Li fanboy trap? Interesting to know actually. This is the first ever Lian Li case product that I've ever had my hands on, and I can see why they got their reputation. Or is this exactly what you expect from this price point? I think that's actually true. In this case, I think you spend more and you get more product. Let me know in the comments, and let me know if you can think of something better for the same price or cheaper. Maybe less expensive is a better relative term. Hopefully that shouldn't really send off. If you want to check out the review of the TD500 Mesh I compared this so heavily with, please look no further than over there. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to see more. There are some /budget builds coming on the way, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye. I normally do that a bit differently. Anyway, see you next time.